Hello.
You're listening to The Beautiful Idea,
a podcast from a collective of several anarchist and autonomous media producers scattered around the world.
We're bringing you interviews and stories from the front lines of autonomous social movements and struggles, as well as original commentary and analysis.
Follow us on Mastodon and at thebeautifulidea.show.
Thanks for listening.
Hello, and thanks for speaking with me today. We're recording this interview on Friday, January 17th, 2025, just 2 days since the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas was agreed to after 467 days of war. I'm joined now by two former ISM volunteers, and ISM, for listeners who aren't already familiar, stands for the International Solidarity Movement, and we'll talk more about what it does in just a moment. But first, thank you both for being here. Hope you're doing well. Could you introduce yourselves as you'd like to and say when and for how long you volunteered with ISM?
Sure. So I went by Amina in Palestine. I was there for a month in Masfer Yatta, which is south of Hebron in the West Bank. I got back just a few months ago.
I'm Rivi. I was in the West Bank from late November to late December. And I was also there 14 years ago in 2010.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's an interesting contrast to get into. So I'm going to ask you both about how you're feeling about the ceasefire later on. But first, Amina, could we start with you? Could you explain what ISM is and what it does?
So International Solidarity Movement, it's been building relationships throughout Palestine, since the second Intifada. And it basically is a way for international activists to provide protective presence in regions that are under the most accelerated threat of land seizure, ethnic cleansing, settler attacks, army intervention, and whatnot. And it is Palestinian-led on the ground, in that we go where we are asked for additional presence. And by presence, I mean it could be staying in the villages with the families to document and to also help with their daily work, such as olive harvesting or shepherding.
What ISM did prior to October 7th, like in decades past, I think has looked very different than what ISM does now, just based on the type of increased repression from the occupation.
Could you speak a little bit more to that? Like, what is the...
Yeah, in the past, ISM did a lot more direct action, dismantling the wall, things like that currently ISM is not involved in, and I don't believe being asked to do, because the increased violence from the occupation against people doing any kind of direct action.
That's a good point to bring up too. Since October 7th, it's been the biggest increase in illegal settlements and settlement outposts that have ever been constructed throughout the West Bank. So they feel very supported by the occupation and by Western backing to construct those things now. So villages that were previously not under attack are being surrounded and encroached by new outposts. So that's kind of more the focus of ISM since October 7th.
Thanks for that overview, both of you. Can you give now a little bit of an overview of the geography and the political landscape in the West Bank? What was the situation on the ground when you were both there, when you arrived? And also, what does it mean to support the popular resistance in Palestine? Like, what does that look like on the day-to-day?
Well, an overview of the geography and political landscape is a huge question, but there are three different areas in the West Bank: Area A, B, and C. Area A is controlled by the Palestinian Authority, supposedly on all matters. Area B has Israeli military control over security matters, and then supposedly Palestinian Authority over civil matters, and Area C is completely controlled by the occupation. I would say most of ISM's work happens in Area C because that is where there's the most clash between settlers and Palestinians and military and Palestinians, because the occupation is controlling those areas.
I think it's important to highlight just the difference in Area A, B, and C. The biggest thing I saw and was shown by Palestinians was just what are such minor restrictions on daily life imposed by the occupation, like restrictions on what construction materials are allowed in, what permits are granted, even though the grand majority, over 90% of building permits by Palestinians are rejected by the occupation in the West Bank. It limits whether concrete or cement is allowed in. So you have these settler civil administration patrolling the area. And even though they agree that it's technically Palestinian land, they will come and harass you and threaten to come back with the army to dismantle a new shed for a newborn donkey that a Palestinian family has built and things like that. That is all just kind of bureaucracy weaponized in ways that is nothing like any of us coming from the US, at least, will have ever experienced. So I think the biggest takeaway for me from what I saw of just small examples of resistance was that even if you file all the correct paperwork, if you play by the occupation's rules, you will not get your permit granted. You'll still come and get attacked the very next day that you build something within the law that they claim is the law. And that was the resistance that I saw. People saying like, yes, look, we are playing by your rules. You're still inflicting violence upon us, but we're still going to, farm and graze and cultivate our land. And we'll still respond when you attack us in that process. So it's this really big kind of like postmodern mix of resistance as filing bureaucratic paperwork and reappealing, refiling, submitting documents to lawyers, submitting construction permits, and then also just the confrontations that you have with the extremist settlers that come armed and masked with pipes and rocks to throw at you, and then the army that comes to back them up. And I don't know, just the daily contrasts of the mundanities and the violence is kind of what stuck out to me as the day-to-day resistance there.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that answer. And I'm wondering if you could also add what does it look like to support the popular resistance, Amina? And then Rivi, I'm going to ask you the same question.
Yeah, for me, what I experienced supporting that was just actually feeling like your presence is very welcome and very important there, because there is the importance of that, Western, European or American passport. You're not going to be subject to the same cruelty and repression and legal consequences that any Palestinian will be. So by virtue of your presence with that passport, which you keep on you at all times to show for that purpose, there is kind of a power there. And you do put your body between the settlers who trespass and even try to break into Palestinian homes. And sometimes just you're under constant surveillance when you're there by the occupation and by the settlers, because they build these outposts with high-tech security and surveillance. They come and try to break Palestinian security cameras and stuff. So the playing field is never fully equal, but the knowledge of international activists being in a Palestinian home is often really all it takes for them to delay their planned attack on a particular piece of land. And, it almost sounds too good to be like accurate, but when you get there, you actually see them sometimes do their patrols and try to show up. And then they see that there are people and sometimes journalists also present documenting their actions. And it does temporarily, at least, maybe just for that day, just for while you're there, delay whatever they had planned. And that's what the Palestinians have expressed, and that's what they feel. They say, we think the army is coming tonight. Can you please have somebody stay with us? Because it'll be different if others are there.
I think one of the tricky things about protective presence is that the better it works, the less it feels like it's working. Like if you're there and no incidences are happening, it feels a little bit like, what am I doing here? But that is protective presence working. And I feel like there can be a feeling like, oh, I'm always in the wrong place at the wrong time. The incident didn't happen where I was. The incident happened at a different house than the one I was staying at. But again, that's protective presence working. The incident didn't happen where you are because of being there, because of internationals being there.
That's a really interesting way of framing it. Yeah, that the more effective it is, the less notable maybe you feel it is. So I'm also wondering something that came up when we were sort of planning out how we wanted this interview to go together, was this difference between accompaniment and solidarity. If Rivi, maybe you could speak to that a little bit, because I think it's a distinction that's been made when talking about ISM before.
Yeah, so I think that there are places, and especially this is true of my experience in Masfariata in the south, where a lot of resistance looks like people just living their lives, trying to stay on their land and live the lives that they have always lived. And that is where we're doing accompaniment. In other places, the resistance looks more like having demonstrations or actively fighting back when people come onto their land. I was there nearby to several settler buses being shot by armed resistance. And when you're in places where there's more direct violence coming from the Palestinians and demonstrations, it's less accompaniment and more solidarity, what you're doing. So in demonstrations, the army is not necessarily distinguishing between who's a Palestinian and who's an international. Obviously, we can see that very clearly with Aishanor's murder. She was an American citizen. And similarly in Kusra, where I was, when the occupation forces would come into town, snipers would come into town at night, and it didn't matter if I was a Palestinian or an American, they're not making that distinction. We were there with the Palestinian youth in the streets when the snipers were there in solidarity, but we weren't really doing accompaniment. Our presence did not mean there was going to be less violence. We were there to build trust with the Palestinian youth who were resisting.
Thanks for that. I think that's a really, really helpful and useful distinction. I'm wondering if you could speak also to why maybe that is, or like, what is it about the context in a given space or location that makes it more of an accompaniment space versus more of a solidarity space?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't know how useful it is to say which is more effective than the other. Like you both also said, you won't know because it was effective, and you won't know what the outcome would have been if you hadn't been there for either accompaniment or solidarity. But accompaniment can also turn into solidarity work. For instance, if there's resistance among the youth occurring during protective presence, I think it's all really interlinked, and that they shouldn't be viewed as in contrast to each other. I think both are the same form of solidarity work, whether it's at a demonstration or in somebody's home. And it's really just about the Palestinians around you that are dictating what the situation will call for, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I think what I meant was more the difference between accompaniment and solidarity being more how the occupation views what's happening rather than anything about what's more or less effective.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And it sounds like it's also not really something that's in anyone's control, right?
Yeah.
The occupation starts they're always the ones throwing the first stone, so to speak.
Yeah, it fluctuates.
So to answer your question as to why sometimes it looks more like accompaniment, protective presence, I should say, and why sometimes it looks more like solidarity, with the distinction that I kind of already described, I think it's based on the occupation, and I think the history of each place kind of dictates how the occupation views people or actions within that place. So like the Beta demos, which is where Aishanor was killed, the Beta demo starts with just a bunch of people praying on the ground in a small playground. I mean, you can't get more kind of quote unquote peaceful than that, but the Beta demo is a place where there's a lot of violence from the occupation. It's not a place that ISM considers us doing protective presence because they don't feel like our presence is protective in that way. The Beta demos are a place ISM in general considers our work to be solidarity. We're there to be in solidarity with the Palestinians, but it's a different type of work than the protective presence. And even if the Palestinians, whether they're throwing stones or not, whether they're praying, the Beta demo is a place where the occupation views it as violence and a direct threat to them.
Yep.
Gotcha.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. So sort of building off of that last question, I'm wondering if you all could go into more specifics about the forms of resistance to the occupation that you saw Palestinians engaging in during your time on the ground there. Rivi, you mentioned seeing armed resistance at an event that you were present at on the ground. So I'm wondering if you all could talk about different examples of resistance that you saw during your time there.
Sure. I keep going back to how much it sticks out to me about the bureaucracy, and that can also be seen in the checkpoints and all of the other, I don't need to get into the background of all of that repression that is daily life for Palestinians in the West Bank. But for instance, during the olive harvest, something I didn't realize before going there to help with the olive harvest was that Palestinians have to apply for permits from the army to actually harvest on their own land. And this is largely determined by settlers in the area who may then have the power to say, no, that particular group of families can't harvest that day because I need to transport a cow or a goat that day. And it's very dangerous for me, a settler, if they are also in the area. So it's obviously completely arbitrary. It's an extra roadblock and hurdle. And a common form of resistance in that regard is that Palestinians will obviously still harvest olives on their own land. There were cases of Palestinians whose homes were burnt down by settlers, with the army present and watching, and nothing coming of that, obviously, justice-wise, however you define justice. But they would still return to that land. They would still harvest the olives, even next to their burnt down houses. There was a lot of collective punishment attempted to be enacted, in that the occupation would say, if you have international volunteers present with you during your olive harvest, that means your entire village can't harvest olives unless they're gone. And, Palestinians reject that. They reject the permits sometimes. Like Rivi said, it's literally just waking up in the West Bank as a Palestinian every single day is resistance, and just going about their lives as though they were free from the occupation is the resistance that I most saw. And I guess another one would be a gradual decolonization in the form of people taking their land back by returning to villages and places that they were expelled from and attempted ethnically cleansed from. You don't really hear about that as winning report backs, but that's happening on a smaller scale all the time throughout the West Bank, that they come back and they rebuild, things get burned down and demolished by bulldozers. I saw that a lot. And just the knowledge that they will come back is something that you see all the time.
Yeah, in Kusra, there's a lot of Palestinian youth. I don't really know how to talk about the Shabab in Kusra. I don't throw anyone under the bus.
I would say to that, and that the occupation is going to say that people were throwing stones, whether or not they were actually throwing stones.
But
and
also,
I think
the youth do throw stones, and I think it's important not to minimize those actions and say the Palestinians were only peaceful, because
no, exactly. That's absolutely, I was absolutely getting to that too.
Especially in Kusra, the youth are from the age of 6-7 years old. The Palestinian boys are fighting. I mean, they're fighting settlers who come with machine guns into their land.
Yeah,
and it's both. I mean, it's wild to see children as young as 6 or 7. Yelling, "Oh, come fight me. If you're a real man, come fight me," to settlers who are on their land.
Yeah.
And it's simultaneously, I mean, it's very cool in some ways to see how fierce these kids are and how passionate they are. And also, it fills me with a lot of grief that these kids are treated as enemy combatants from the time they're 6-7 years old, and how difficult it must be to be soft if you're a Palestinian boy growing up under the occupation.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, yeah, it's absolutely remarkable to see how resistance in youth is the default there. I mean, it's not something that can be taught, even stone throwing aside, just in small examples. If it's okay to share kind of a adjacent anecdote about resistance youth and how that shifted my perspective
Totally
about an aspect of it, because I was kind of sharing this story in real time to my remote support group chat, where I had people back home who I would check in with every day and give vague updates about and stuff, and it triggered a pretty interesting discussion. But so when I was staying over with a home in a very remote village with a family who had been under some of the most severe attacks from settlers because of the outposts that had been, increasingly constructed all around encircling them. And at one point, settlers had come, and this particular day that I was there, they didn't break in or assault the adults, but it was a very recurring pattern, is what I'll say. Basically, fear and trauma was very high in that particular place. And the kids, though, after the settlers were successfully made to go away, we were having kind of a dance party, when we were playing like Liebe Palestina, the Swedish song and some other kind of Palestinian type national anthem remixes and everything, that they all knew the same songs that get played at these like, peaceful marches that are in the US, the same exact songs. But these kids were, like Rivi was saying, also, 6 years old, 7, 8, whatever. They were waving Palestinian flags on long wires, and they were standing on the hilltops, basically, where all of the settlement outposts could absolutely see that, the same ones that were made to retreat. And another volunteer that I was with there started telling the kids to put the Palestinian flags inside, that we shouldn't be playing this music, that we shouldn't be waving the flags because the settlers will come back, because they'll view this as provocation, and that the adults are maybe not very close by, and that it's us by ourselves, the kids by themselves. It's extremely dangerous. And I found myself like really agreeing with that, because my instinct there is to protect the kids from these settlers who I feel utter rage about for doing what they do to all of these families. And, so I was like, yeah, maybe we better go inside. But then another international who was actually Palestinian himself kind of added like, no, fuck that. These kids need to be able to express themselves this way and not be made to feel afraid of. And that really shifted something for me, because I didn't realize as it was happening that this little like flag waving dance party that we were having was a form of resistance in and of itself. Because to me, it then was presented as danger, something that needs to be shut down for everyone's safety. But no, that it just really, really clarified something for me in that very moment. And it's something that I shifted my perspective about how I view resistance back home too. I don't know if that winding anecdote made sense, but it was really impactful. Like the kids understand it more innately than we're taught. We're neutered basically to be like, no, don't do that. That'll endanger you. That'll endanger the people around you. That'll endanger the march. The police will retaliate. The settlers will retaliate. The army will come. And all of this disguised in this like Western mindset coddling is what's keeping us back mentally. And I don't know. For me, that was really eye-opening.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's a really helpful story. I'm actually wondering, you said this impacted or shifted something for you when you thought about resistance back home too, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Well, I just saw the same parallels about how, I mean, it feels like such an inconsequential parallel to even draw, to be like, at a big march where they're like, we must be peaceful because otherwise the police will attack. But, the police will attack regardless. The settlers will attack regardless. All of the caution wrapped in this is for your safety is actually more furthering, the oppressor's goals or the police's goals or the army's goals, the occupation's goals. And I don't know. I think the biggest takeaway is that, yeah, the kids should be able to express themselves without fear and not be told to stop for their own alleged safety. And it's something we've internalized so much in the US as well, that like, don't do this, it's for your safety. And it's something that I think, we say like decolonize your mind. And I think that's a really big, important part of that.
Yeah. Thank you. Ruby, did you have anything else to add to this question?
Amina's story about the flag waving just reminded me of in Kusra while I was there. A man was murdered standing on his roof with his daughter. And we went to the funeral the next day. And the funeral was a kind of a procession from the hospital, which was in Nablus, I think, although I should look that up. The hospital where he was taken back to Kusra and then through the streets of Kusra. And how there's hundreds of people marching through the streets, and it was simultaneously both like full of grief and people like, his family and his friends sobbing and stricken, and also waving, flags of pretty much every different Palestinian resistance movement, and how the grief and the resistance are so intertwined when death is so part of your daily experience in Palestine. There's not time for grief and time for resistance, but that your grief is part of the resistance.
Thank you. These are such incredible answers. Seriously, thank you both. I'm wondering if you could both talk a little bit about why you first decided to work ISM to go to Palestine? Rivi, maybe you could start.
I decided to work with ISM because I felt like of all the different groups that I was personally aware of doing solidarity work in Palestine, ISM seemed the most in line with my politics as an anarchist, both that it at least had a history of doing direct action and was consensus-based were two of the things that drew me to it, in addition to just having known people from my community who had already volunteered with ISM.
And I'm just curious, had you been to Palestine before you traveled there to work with ISM?
I was in Palestine 14 years ago in 2010, and at that time I was just traveling by myself, but I ended up at demonstrations with people from ISM, so I talked to people from ISM then, but I was not part of ISM when I was in Palestine 14 years ago.
And Amina, what led you to work with ISM?
Yeah, just echoing what Rivi said, it seemed the most aligned with my own politics and anarchist principles. I had heard of it before through knowing about Rachel Corrie, and I actually didn't realize that it was still ongoing when I sent, my I'm interested in going email. And then basically the day after I did that, we received news of Aishanor's murder. And the fact that that didn't shift anything for me, that it still felt equally important, if not more important, to go, I think really solidified for me that it was the right decision at the right time.
Wow. So you applied to go just a day before Aishanor was murdered?
Yeah, I read about it the day before and then told my first, close friend and comrade in my affinity group that I was doing it. And yeah, a few hours later, that same friend sent me the news about Aishanor. And I had to battle some thoughts about how I was scared to hear things like, why would somebody choose to do this? It's, are people trying to be martyrs when they could be doing so much more good if they stay at home and things like that. But thankfully, that was pretty easy to shut down and wasn't anything that I heard from anyone.
Yeah, I'm actually curious. How did you shut that down? Because I think that is a common refrain that people hear when talking about accompaniment work in general. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about that process for yourself.
I didn't feel like I was making a direct impact by anything that I was doing at home, even direct actions or attending demonstrations. I mean, donating to fundraising campaigns, because I had, the physical ability, including like able-bodiedness, of course, which is kind of a pretty excluding factor, unfortunately, because it is like physically hard to go there. I had that. I had the ability to afford it because of my job. All of these things put together, that was actually the more impactful thing that I could do when there's a lot of feelings of powerlessness that I was feeling, and a lot of people I know are still feeling about how, what can we actually do for Palestine or for any other liberation struggle elsewhere. And in this case, the answer indeed was that this was something that made a direct impact.
I want to add on really fast about what Amina was saying about people saying, like, why are you going to be a martyr? I just want to add, because it was really hard for me to find parents who'd gone to Palestine. And so I just, in case anyone's listening who's also a parent, I got a lot of pushback, like, oh, what you're doing is dangerous to your child. What if something happens to you while you're in Palestine and your child has to grow up without you? And that was really hard to hear, but for me, it felt so important to distinguish between what is best for my child as a white Jewish American citizen. And if I always do only what's best for my child, I will be upholding white supremacy. And that what is best for the safety of children in the world is sometimes in direct conflict with what is the safest thing for my child. And that still felt like an important decision to be able to make and go to Palestine anyway. I just wanted to add that on because it felt very hard to find parents who had been part of ISM to talk to.
That's really beautiful. I can't imagine what it was like to be a parent there. There was someone in Masfer Yatta when I was there who was a mom as well. And she said very similar things to what you just said about how she had to tell a lot of people that it's, she has children, but also Palestinians are everyone's children too.
When I was at the hospital before the beginning of the funeral in Kusra for the man who was martyred, that day that we were driving there from Kusra to the hospital was a day that there was attacks by the occupation all over the area in the refugee camps. And as we were driving, it's only like a 45-minute drive, but we were hearing like, oh, 3 more people martyred here, 3 more people martyred in this refugee camp, 3 more people martyred in this camp. And when we got to the hospital, we were standing outside the hospital with the crowd that was gathering, and they started bringing bodies by. And one of the bodies they brought by was a small child. And as a parent, that was incredibly hard to keep it together.
Yeah, that sounds extremely intense and difficult, especially as a parent. And thanks for sharing that story. Many people come into nonviolent accompaniment work, like the kind that ISM does, because they believe in nonviolence specifically as a strategy of resistance to displacement, to colonization, to war. I'm wondering how did y'all's experience in Palestine impact your understanding of the role of accompaniment, if it did impact it at all? And what is your analysis of the work that ISM does?
Yeah, I think one of the really challenging things about doing, as internationals, doing work in Palestine is that I think anywhere in the world, the main thing that allows solidarity work to be successful and meaningful is building relationships with people. And it's just inherently going to be challenging when the maximum amount of time you can stay in Palestine is 3 months at any given time. So I think, I mean, and that's not a critique of the work, it's just a roadblock to building lasting relationships and doing meaningful solidarity work in Palestine as an international, is that every 3 months you have to leave, and the more times you come back, the harder and harder it becomes to enter the country.
And I'm actually just curious because I don't know. Does ISM work with Israeli volunteers as well, or are the people that work with ISM exclusively from outside of Israel, Palestine?
ISM exclusively works with internationals and then Palestinian coordinators on the ground. There are, in Masfar Yatta, especially where I was, there are a number of people who hold Israeli citizenship who are not Palestinian, who work kind of in tandem with ISM, but are very explicitly not part of ISM. But those folks do not consider themselves to be Israelis. And I think that comes less from a desire to separate themselves from the privilege of having Israeli citizenship, and more to do with the fact that they really wanted to impress upon me that there is no pro-Palestine solidarity movement within Israel, and to mistake their work in the West Bank as being any kind of Israeli movement. And I think when I called them Israelis, they were like, we're not Israelis. There is no Israeli movement against the occupation.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
They sometimes call themselves the Hebrew speakers to kind of distinguish between any kind of Israeli movement.
What do you think that's about for them? Like not wanting to be, what do they mean by saying there is no pro-Palestine movement there is no Israeli pro-Palestine movement?
Well, they're defectors in that way, right? They're not representative of a movement when they do work in the West Bank, because it doesn't exist. Like the absolute grand majority of everyone living within 48 supports ethnic cleansing, supports the genocide in Gaza, supports annexation and destruction of the West Bank. I mean, these are major outliers who are there as, humans who in most cases were born there, but found their way to resist where they can as well. The occupation can't deport them like they can deport us. So that's the main privilege of their citizenship.
Ruby, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, I guess I can't speak for them as to why they felt so strongly not to make that distinction. All I can say is that for me, as a Jewish person, it felt inspiring to see that there were some people, at least a few people, who had Israeli citizenship that were giving up a lot of who were working in solidarity with the Palestinians. And when I said that to them, their response was like, we are not an Israeli movement. Like, don't consider us. We don't consider ourselves Israeli because we think that gives the impression that there is an Israeli movement against the occupation, and there's not. So I can't really speak beyond that, but I think it was more just like a pessimism about, I don't know. One of the Israeli citizens who has been working against the occupation for decades, said on my very first day in Palestine, we were asked what our hopes and fears were, and they said, I don't have any hope, but I don't think this movement requires hope to act. And I really agree with that. That really resonated with me.
Yeah, wow. You guys keep kind of dropping like totally new thought pieces to consider at the end of each question here.
I can kind of try and readdress the question about the nonviolent accompaniment work.
Yeah, sure. I think it's sort of related to this last piece you just said, right? About like you don't need hope to act. So maybe if you could link those things, that I think that would be really interesting.
I think that for ISM to continue doing the work that they do, it is critical that they identify themselves as a nonviolent movement, because if not, the occupation would label it a terrorist group immediately, and it would just stop all of their ability to work. So I think it's, in that sense, for any organization to be doing Palestinian solidarity work as an organization, it is like crucial for them to be nonviolent. I do think that many people come to ISM who do not necessarily follow the principles of nonviolence or don't ethically believe in the principles of nonviolence. So I want to make a distinction between ISM is a nonviolent movement because you have to be in order to be doing work in Palestine. But I think many people who join ISM are anarchist and don't ethically make a distinction between violence and nonviolence as like an ethical line.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it's almost like a strategic identification as nonviolent rather than an ideological one.
Yeah, and it's a strategic, not only a strategic wording, but strategically, it is, I think for many people in ISM, including myself, violent versus nonviolent is never an ethical line. It's almost always a strategic line. For instance, as members of ISM, we are not able to participate, and as internationals, there are many ways in which we should not be participating in violent acts of resistance, because, if somebody's going to make that choice, and Palestinians are going to get the blowback, that choice should be made by a Palestinian, of course. But in Masfar, one of the ways that we felt like we could support, for instance, the settler bus, there was a settler bus that was shot up by a Palestinian armed resistance fighter while we were there. We obviously played no role in that. We were not in the same places that was happening. But one of the ways that we wanted to support from afar Palestinians making those choices was to agree in Masfar. We had a consensus vote that we would not take any settler buses, any of the bus systems that go between the settlements in the West Bank, part of the apartheid bus system. The only reason for an ISM person to take a settler bus is for convenience. You can always get where you wanted to go without taking a settler bus. It might just take a lot longer. And one of the reasons that we did that, partly because we didn't want to give any money or implicit support to the occupation, but the other reason was, if you were on a settler bus, you are going to inherently hope that that settler bus is not attacked by a Palestinian resistance fighter. And we didn't want to put ourselves, even just mentally, in this role of hoping that Palestinians are not fighting back, because our life might be on the line. So we agreed that if somebody broke that consensus, it would be a case-by-case basis, but they might be asked to leave ISM. And that was just a decision made in Masfar. That wasn't ISM-wide. We were going to bring it to a wider meeting, but we never did. While I was there, I left before it was brought to a wider vote. But I think there are ways in which you want to protect yourself. And so if you are putting yourself in a position in which Palestinians fighting back could harm you, there is a way in which you are hoping they are not going to fight back. And it felt important to us to make sure that we were not putting ourselves in those positions for convenience.
Did you ever discuss that with the Palestinians that you were accompanying?
At that time, when we had that discussion and that vote, it was brought up that there were some of the Palestinians we worked with in Masfar had specified that they had no issue with the internationals taking those buses. And that was just a few people's opinions. That was not necessarily, we didn't talk to like a wider Palestinian community about it or anything. But to me, it still felt important. Whether or not the Palestinians that we were working with in Masfar had wanted us not to take the buses.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm wondering if there's anything else that you want to add to this question around the work that ISM does and the role of nonviolent accompaniment work.
I agree with everything that Rivi has added, and I have to admit that when I was also, told that we shouldn't take settler buses because they're dangerous, I actually assumed that meant because of settler violence and that they would, ID you and notice you that you don't belong there and are clearly part of internationalism, resistance, and stuff. So that's how much of my mental framework has shifted too. That I realized pretty quickly that cautionary note was actually about what Palestinian resistance might do a shooting operation against those buses. And yeah, and Ruby put it really perfectly that it's a bad mental. Not bad, but it's incongruent with my principles as well to hope that there's not resistance out of my own convenience. And that applies to not accidentally standing in the way when, Shabab are throwing rocks. Like, you don't want to, it's friendly fire if so, but it kind of messes everyone up if you're worried about yourself or putting yourself between what would be happening regardless of if you were there or not. So yeah, that was a pretty neat way to get closure about that when I realized that's what the bus note was about. I'm not really sure what I have to add about that. I mean, the occupation is going to call us violent foreign anarchists who are dead set on making up lies about the peaceful, observant religious settlers, and that we're the ones who are setting cars on fire and causing violence, and that we are the ones that need to have a fucking occupation task force formed against to hunt and trap and deport. But that also goes to show that even if it sometimes doesn't feel like protective presence is doing anything, the major emphasis that the occupation is putting on finding us and stopping us from entering the West Bank kind of shows that we are actually kind of a threat to their plans. And that to me is reason enough to want to keep going for as long as I can and to come back for as long as, of course, the Palestinians will have us and me there.
Thank you. So kind of, again, building off of that, I'm wondering what sort of international solidarity do you all think would be the most strategically effective in anti-colonial struggle? That's a very big question. Amina, I think you've already spoken to this a little bit, but we can come back to you in a second. Rivi, do you have an initial answer for that question?
I mean, I think that's a huge question. And also, I mean, one of the reasons I went to Palestine is because it felt so, all the international solidarity I was seeing felt so fruitless and so hopeless. But one of the things this question brings to mind is how surprised I was by a number of internationals I met in Palestine, some working with ISM and some working with other organizations, who had a very strong anti-colonial critique of Israel's occupation of Palestine, but were very proud nationalists of their own countries. And so I think there can be a tendency to see what's happening in Palestine as separate from the colonization and anti-colonial struggles back at home. That's true very much so here in the United States. But also in many other countries, in many European countries, the anti-colonial struggle might not be within their country. It might be against, where their country is occupying outside of their borders. But I think that was one of the takeaways I had, was just how much Palestinian anti-colonial work requires making the connection with anti-colonial work around the rest of the world and fighting against nationalism all over the world.
Thanks. Amina, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that as well. And I don't know, I was just, you also asked me earlier about, what did I mean by taking that lesson home? And as part of anti-colonial work, anti-imperialist work, I do think kind of killing the individualism that we have in our respective countries, like one of the ways that I think we are kept really defanged is by the constant threat of isolation. We're told if we resist, we'll lose our jobs, we'll lose our freedom via incarceration, we'll lose our connections to our community because we're incarcerated, we'll lose our livelihood, we'll lose our reputation because, even publications will dox us for even minor violations if we're not imprisoned. The goal is to isolate, to remind us that we're isolated. And I was thinking about all the people I talked to in Palestine, and you won't really find a village anywhere that is where it's not the case that every man or every teen, even over the age of 18, hasn't suffered from the regime by being imprisoned in an Israeli military prison. And it's not a threat to them, even martyrdom is not the same threat there. And they will never feel that the occupation can threaten them with anything that they can't handle, that they won't have support from their families and their communities and their villages, and even now the international community from. But here we're told that if we take any kind of risk at home when we're not abroad, or if we take a risk when we're abroad, that'll carry back to us. It'll harm our families. It'll harm us. It'll effectively kill us. And I would love to do anything I could to fight back against that, because unfortunately that threat very much works on me too. I stayed so unarrestable with, a clean internet presence and stuff like that, knowing that I would have to, be interrogated by Israeli border agents on my way in to do solidarity work in the West Bank. Like one arrest, and that's all it'll cost you, your ability to continue the fight, to continue supporting the resistance. And I don't know, it's just something I still think about and I don't have an answer to, but we just, the threats have really worked on us. And I don't know how we can have hope or move. We don't need hope, like Ravi said, but I don't know how we can move forward until we kill that voice in our head and actually say that, no, we will support our prisoners. We will do jail support, prison support. We will prevent our comrades from being taken. We just don't have that. We don't have the guarantee of fighting against isolation. And that's the thing that it'll take for us to actually do anything of impact here or abroad. So I don't know.
Thank you. Yeah. So you're saying that to kill that voice in our head, we need to fight against isolation. Do you want to say a little bit more about how you think we kill that voice?
Well, even just contrasting Palestinian prisoner support networks to, prisoner support networks elsewhere. It's really different. It's not the severity of the prisons. Obviously, I think we can all agree that the Israeli military prisons are committing murder and torture and isolation at a greater rate. But the prisons in the U.S. are death camps too. We have legalized slavery with those. It's just as bad here and just going to keep getting worse. And I don't know. I think for people who can't go abroad to participate in this internationalist struggle physically as frontliners, just prisoner support and prisoner solidarity, that's letter writing, that's advocating for campaigns, that's doing court support, that's commissary, that's so many things that can be done. I think just the message of you are not alone is what keeps a lot of Palestinian resistance alive, because nobody will ever fully feel alone participating in that struggle, and we just don't have that here. So sorry, that's not very fully fledged out.
No,
it kind of occurred to me as we were talking, but I do like to support it to abolitionist struggle here. It's all connected, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Before we move on to the next question, Rivi, I wanted to circle back to something that you said earlier around this thing that someone said when you first came to Palestine, that was that you don't need hope in order to take action. And you said that really resonated with you. And I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about why that resonated with you so much.
I think that resonated with me because I think a lot of my politics as an anarchist are about acting without hope. Because I think, there are so many crises facing us all the time. I feel like it's almost naive to have hope that things are going to get better. But that doesn't, so you can be a nihilist and just do nothing, but that's so self-serving. And I don't know, it's hard. I don't think I'm giving a very good answer, but it's especially apparent to me having a young child, like how to teach my young child about acting in a world in which we don't have hope and what it means to not have hope for the future of my own child. Yeah, you could use that to give up, but what would be the point? Like, all we have is our life right in front of us now, and you have to do whatever it takes to make that meaningful, even if you don't think that there is a future or that there's a good future.
Thank you. Wow. That reminds me of something that Miriam Kaba says sometimes. I don't know if you're familiar with her work around abolition. She talks about hope as a discipline, which feels like a contrast a little bit to what you're saying. But it's just coming to me right now that it seems like they're sort of two sides of the same coin. So continuing on to another question, and this is another pretty big one, but how did this experience change you? Let's start with you, Amina.
Yeah, I mean, it solidified the fact that this is a struggle, or the struggle that I want to keep helping with, and I want to return as soon as possible. It makes my day to day feel pretty maladaptive ever since I've gotten back, because instead of waking up and immediately like anticipating what the next settler army attack will be that day, I have to think about my work tasks or what I'm going to do this weekend with my friends. You know, it's not that I feel guilty or undeserving of that, but the contrast of coming home, and I'm like really freshly returned, like, I mean, barely a month and a half. So it's still pretty fresh, but you know, and for 2 weeks after I got back, the sounds of the train and the planes and the just general traffic outside. I live in a big city here. It all immediately made me feel like I was hearing all the warplanes again, you know, because the IOF flies their warplanes from bases south of the West Bank, very south of where we were, on their way to, at that time, to either bomb Gaza or Lebanon. And I think that was part of their kind of psychological torture too on the West Bank, saying like, you know, you next. But it's objectively not fair and not right that I wake up feeling safe and not worried about the things that I and the Palestinian families that I was staying with had to worry about every single day. It has cast a shadow on like everything I do kind of day to day here, where I'm not worried for my safety. Yeah, so it doesn't feel right to not return as soon as I can. I don't know if that's, you know, a Jewish ancestral thing as well. I think about Jewish resistance movements too, about not wanting to like lay down and fight and accept anything. And yeah, it kind of consumes you. So I wouldn't, that's actually kind of another reason I wouldn't necessarily recommend going to Palestine to volunteer for just everyone, because, you know, if you're prone to anxiety and like PTSD and things like that, like, I mean, it's not something that leaves you very quickly and easily. And it's violence and cruelty that you see every day and think about and hear about every day while you're there. Just constant people being shot and abducted and so many things. Like it doesn't leave you, but it confirms that it was the right place for you to be and a place for you to come back if that's what you feel is right to do. So I don't know if that answers that. I don't know if anything changed in me. It just confirmed what I already thought was true. So
thank you. Ruby, do you have anything to add here?
I feel like I've been, less so now. I'm like 3 weeks out from coming back from Palestine, but I definitely was really disassociated for the first few weeks. I think sometimes you have to be farther away from an experience to kind of understand how it changed you. I think being too close to an experience, it's pretty easy to just kind of be too disassociative to really be able to tell.
I'm also curious. I mean, it sounds like like you just said, it's a little too soon for you to be able to answer that question fully. But I'm also curious if this shifted anything politically for either of you. It sounds like both of you are coming to this experience with pretty solid sort of understandings of your own political positions and maybe ideologies, although I don't know if you would use that word. But I am just curious if anything shifted in your understanding of strategy or ideology after this.
Not really. I guess just again solidified, put some theory into some sort of praxis in a way.
I agree. I think that politically, the first time I went to Palestine 14 years ago had a much bigger effect politically on me, just because of how much younger I was and that I didn't have as firm an understanding of the world or Palestine or resistance in general at that time. So, and this time felt much more affirming of what I believe, I guess. Amina touched briefly on some kind of Jewish ancestry to resistance in being part of their experience in Palestine. I guess this was an answer to the very first question you asked, but, one of the reasons I went is because my family also experienced genocide, and some people risked their lives for us and not enough did. And yeah, I don't know, I don't want to look back and think about how I could have supported people undergoing genocide, but didn't.
Yep.
Thank you. So, with this recent news about the ceasefire, I'm wondering how the two of you are feeling about that, and what thoughts and emotions are coming up for you right now in the wake of the ceasefire announcement.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sharing in the absolute joy that I'm seeing Palestinians are experiencing, especially those in Gaza. I can't even begin to imagine what it feels like, and the celebrations and the relief. I mean, obviously there's still bombardment, and I don't know, what kind of really upset me was seeing all their posts about the reacting to the ceasefire with joy, and people who aren't affected in any way, shape, or form by any of it saying like, well, actually, Israel has a history of reneging on ceasefire agreement. They're going to start the genocide right back up again. Don't celebrate this. We should not be like, just the need to have some sort of political analysis and condescendingly correct people who are experiencing that kind of joy, like, really was awful to read. That seemed to almost be the instinctual reaction, at least, that a lot of people had. And I don't know, I found a better place is just to see the joy and the reactions from Palestinians in Gaza. Of course, it was, I don't know, there was another ceasefire in November 2023, just like, a month into the genocide. And just even reading those same people who were sharing their experiences then, saying they went to go sit on the beach, and it was the first day in a month that they could do that without hearing the sound of drones overhead. And just to contrast them crying tears of joy from a ceasefire that was just 1 month in to over a year later. I mean, it's indescribable to imagine. So yeah, I don't know. I'm overjoyed, and I don't know. The reactions have been bizarre to read, especially the ones who are trying to like stomp down on that joy or tell people not to feel joy just yet or whatever.
I certainly would never tell Palestinians in Gaza that they shouldn't celebrate any news that might make their lives a little bit easier or make them more likely to literally survive another day. But I also I have kind of the opposite reaction. I mean, I feel like hearing people who are not living that day-to-day life celebrating the news to me, has been almost like naive, because it's true that Israel does have a history of breaking ceasefires. Or when Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, I think it was, they immediately were able to start other types of actions because they didn't have Israeli citizens within these territories anymore.
Oh, yeah, no, yeah. Sorry.
So I think when I hear this, I am filled with fear. And for me, what I am filled with fear about is that there is some movement in Israel currently to stop the war. And as soon as the Israeli hostages, I should say, because of course, as we know, there are tens of thousands of Palestinian hostages within Israel. As soon as the Israeli hostages are released, any semblance of being against the war will disappear completely. And that is my great fear, I think, when I hear the news of the ceasefire. I also read an article in the Israeli, what's it called?
Haaretz?
The Times of Israel? No, it's a more conservative one than Haaretz. The Times of Israel, I think, that said that in the vote today, because actually it wasn't until like this evening Israeli time, that they actually agreed to the ceasefire. I don't think they actually agreed 2 days ago when the media started to report it, but the Netanyahu and other ministers were very clear that the deal includes being able to resume intensive fighting with the full backing of the United States at any point if Hamas does not accept Israeli security demands. So for me, I hear ceasefire, and I hope that, of course, I hope that Palestinians, this means something real for Palestinians, especially Palestinians in Gaza, about their survival. And I'm also like filled with fear about what it means.
Yeah. No, I do agree with you there. I think when I answered that, I don't know. I'm actually surprised by how much I detached myself from my own feelings about that. And yeah, no, I don't ever feel anything but fear and dread about the next, even worse thing to come, especially in terms of with the incoming American administration and what that means for the West Bank. Fear and dread is definitely still ongoing. Yeah, I just meant that it feels like a few days of relief and joy and celebration, and that felt nice to see them experiencing. But yeah, I mean, everything you're saying is accurate, and everything everyone is saying is accurate about how it's probably short-lived.
So I'm hearing from you, Rivi, that there's a fear that the ceasefire is actually an end to meaningful resistance to the occupation as it stands currently.
No, what I'm saying is that my fear is that I don't think that resistance to the war happening in Israel is a resistance to the occupation. I think there is a movement within Israel, within 48, against the current war because of the way it endangers the Israeli hostages who are still within Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
I do not think it is a movement against the occupation. And that is why I think that as soon as Israeli hostages are no longer within Gaza, there will be no movement whatsoever against the war.
Right.
Within 48.
Right. Okay. You're making a distinction between the war and the occupation.
Yes.
Okay.
The current war, genocide that began on October 7th, that war.
Yeah, there'll be no more resistance to that war within 48 after the ceasefire.
After the rest of the Israeli hostages are released.
Right. Okay. And therefore no more support for an end to the occupation.
Well, I don't think there's support generally in Israel against the occupation. Certainly, I think there's some movements within Israel, some leftist movements, who consider the occupation to be, solely the West Bank. And there's a belief that Israel should not be within the West Bank, but certainly not any movement within Israel against the occupation as a whole from Palestinian land. My great fear is that right now there is pretty widespread opposition by Israelis within 48 against this current iteration of the war that began on October 7th because of the way it endangers the Israeli hostages who are being held in Gaza. I don't think those demonstrations and those protests are against the occupation. I think they are against the current iteration of war and airstrikes happening within Gaza because of the hostages. So my great fear is that once the hostages are released as part of this ceasefire agreement, there will be no more opposition by Israelis within 48 against the continuation of this iteration of war in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza.
Yes, I see. That framing sounds like the support among Israelis against the war currently was perhaps for a time giving some hope that there would be opposition to the occupation itself, or is it sort of, I guess my question is, isn't that sort of irrelevant to the question of whether or not the occupation continues, like the existence of support or lack thereof among Israelis for the occupation or against it?
Yeah, I guess what I mean is that when the citizens of a government are having mass demonstrations against the government, that maybe that sways the government a little bit. I don't really know if it has in Israel or not, but the fact that there are mass demonstrations against this current iteration of the war by Israelis, I mean, maybe that has some effect on Israeli policy within Gaza. I don't know. But I think there will be none of that once the hostages are released.
Mm-hmm.
That movement is not in support of Palestinian life, right? It's in support of Israeli life that is endangered because of the Israelis who are in Gaza right now.
Right. Yeah, this is something. So I think I mentioned this, but I did another interview with another ISM volunteer just yesterday who was talking about their experience, and we were discussing some of these same questions. And to me, there seems to be kind of a parallel between sort of counterinsurgent potential of a ceasefire and the counterinsurgent potential of demands to negotiate for divestment among students during the student encampment, where like a demand for divestment was an important rallying cry that got people involved and brought them into the struggle. But then once universities actually negotiated a lot of times the outcome was that the on the ground movement at the university died, and the encampments were, in order to negotiate with the universities, the encampments disappeared. And to me, that seems like a little bit of a parallel to maybe what you're articulating here, is that the on the ground struggle will disappear because this negotiation has taken place.
Yeah, I don't think that's the same thing, because I don't think that the Israelis who are staging protests have ever been in favor of Palestinian life. They're in favor of Israeli life, and they're scared for the Israelis who are being held. So it's not like they're being told that the demonstrations within Israel against this iteration of the war must stop in order to negotiate for the release of the hostages or something. I just think once the hostages are released, the people who cared won't care because they don't see Palestinians as human. And I think the encampments, what happened with the encampments it just feels really different. The encampments, there was this divestment rallying cry, and then the administration says, in order for us to negotiate, you must dismantle camps. And people somehow, wildly, believed that they actually were going into that in good faith and dismantled their own camps.
Mm-hmm.
But it feels really different because the encampments were
in support of Palestinian life.
Yeah, the encampments were resistance, whereas I see the Israeli movement as being like, yes, they're resisting their government, but not in favor of Palestinian life.
It's interesting. Okay. So the piece you said earlier around how you have a fear of this resistance disappearing, maybe because it has some impact on the Israeli government's policies in Gaza, is not actually...
I guess, okay, to clarify, what I meant by that is a ceasefire would affect the Israeli hostages as well as Palestinian who live in Gaza. So any movement that's for a ceasefire will have an effect on both of those groups of people. Right. So I think the Israelis, even if the Israeli movement against the war is in favor of the hostages, not Palestinians, it will have an effect on both. So long as there are hostages to have an effect on. As soon as the hostages are out of Gaza, there won't be a movement anymore because the Israelis are safe.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. One is done specific. You're talking about the intent of both, and you're making a distinction between the intention behind both of these things, and because they have different intentions, you're saying there's a key difference there. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, I just think it's interesting to think about, I guess maybe more broadly, just the way that negotiations can sometimes kill a ground movement or struggle on the ground.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that is an important distinction that you're making.
I think in 2005, when Israel pulled out of Gaza, there was so much support for Israel doing that. And I remember reading a book written by a Palestinian woman in Gaza that said after Israel pulled out of Gaza, they started doing these daily, I don't know what to call it. They would fly planes really low over people's homes and break the sound barrier. And so it was just these enormous booms all night long. It shattered the glass in their houses. And they couldn't do that when they had Israeli citizens in settlements in Gaza because they would be affected. And I think about that. This thing that looks internationally like they've given a concession, but actually they use that, what looks like a concession, to have other ways of causing psychological trauma on people that's just more invisibilized by the media talking about whatever concession they think Israel gave, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
And I think in this situation, one way that the people I've talked to who are still in Palestine are expecting that to happen is that maybe things will get a little bit better in Gaza, but maybe they will get much, much, much worse in the West Bank, while everyone is kind of eyes on Gaza.
Amita, did you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, agreed with a lot of that, especially about how, the ceasefire protests within Israel were for the hostages and not for Palestinian lives. But a lot of the encampment concessions were from counterinsurgency and bad faith negotiations. I don't think any encampment felt that it really got any divestment wins. But I think that actually there's already a growing, renewed protest movement within Israel, and that's going to be that after the hostages are returned and the bodies of other hostages are returned and the prisoners, the Palestinian captives are returned, that the soldiers are actually not super eager to go back into Gaza, especially that there's not the goal anymore of returning hostages or finding hostages. A lot of them deluded themselves, obviously many, if not most, had the genocidal intent in the first place, and the hostages were always just an excuse. But now they can't even have that pretense, and it is psychologically grueling for them, even though they don't care about Palestinian lives. So there's already a lot of that chatter, even among more like right-wing Israeli spaces and whatnot. I mean, the resistance in Beit Hanu, especially within the past few weeks, served one of the biggest demoralizing blows against the Israeli military and possibly the entire war so far. And they're really not letting that go. They don't want to go back in, and they're going to protest on that ground now. They're saying, don't kill our innocent young boys who are IOF soldiers, is going to be the rallying cry, because it is aimless. It is going to be complicated for them, even with the hostages returned. But like both of you were saying, though, it's not about Palestinian lives. It's not going to be powerful enough to make the actual cabinet stop what they have put into writing that they fully intend to do. So I don't know. Not feeling particularly optimistic about that either.
Yeah, that was my next question, right? Is what do you see on the horizon, and what do you want to see? I think you kind of just spoke to it, but feel free to weigh in on that.
Yeah, and then just the West Bank as well. I mean, there's talk of the incoming cabinets pulling back the sanctions on extremist right-wing settler groups and the organizations that fund new settlements. So money is going to most likely funnel in at an increasing rate, which means they're crowdfunding for weapons and for construction materials and just for bringing more settlers in illegally in the first place. So everything that those areas in the West Bank have been experiencing will accelerate even more. And, nonviolent protective presence isn't going to be what stops it on a, meaningful level in any particular place. And I mean, Israel has also laid out a plan for where they choose to expand and seize land and declare things active military zones. They're building power plants in the West Bank, and they say they need to expel all of the villages around them for this construction. So that's just like all out in the open about what the next steps are. So that's what's on the horizon, unfortunately. And they're building, or rather funding and installing new IOF task forces for what they call Judea and Samara, or if I'm pronouncing that right, I'm not sure, but what they call the West Bank. So yeah, and obviously their escalation with the PA and various refugee camps and in the Jordan Valley. I don't know. It's coming from every direction at every level. And yeah, it is pretty impossible to feel any kind of hope about the situation.
Ruby, do you have anything to add to that question?
I mean, my greatest fear is that this very active genocide will continue or get worse, but one of my other great fears is that it'll go back to the status quo, kind of like what things looked like before October 7th. Mm-hmm. And then that will be really celebrated as a success, like back to peace. Mm-hmm. Because as we know, peace is just the absence of resistance from those being oppressed. So that's one of my other fears too, is that a success would be things going back to the way they were before October 7th, as if the last 15 months hadn't even happened.
Right.
And that is just a horrifying reality to think about also. Because it's the conditions before October 7th that led to Palestinians breaking into Israel, into 48 on October 7th. And to go back to that as a success would just be horrifying in my mind.
Yeah, I think that's a really realistic fear, and certainly something that comes up in thinking around the ceasefire celebrations or lack thereof. So our conversation is coming to a close, but is there anything else that either one of you would like to share with listeners that you feel like we haven't touched on, or that you'd like to circle back to, or that you want to talk a little bit more about?
Just to add like one note to my last very cynical, pessimistic sounding note. I mean, I do envision a free Palestine within our lifetimes, and I think that it'll be Palestinians who free themselves, who free Palestine. And I hope, I really do want to be able to keep witnessing that piece by piece as we have been. It all sounds and feels overwhelming to witness and think about as a whole, but there's so many small acts of resistance that will never make the news, that are barely worth reporting in the group chat too, but there's always going to be more of that than the will of the oppressor and what they're trying to do. And I'm not giving up, and obviously Palestinians aren't giving up. And thanks for letting us talk it out today.
Well, thank you. Thank you both so much for sharing so much and for being so clear and honest about your experiences. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of The Beautiful Idea.
News and analysis from the front lines of anarchist and autonomous struggles everywhere. Catch you next time.